Is the sound on now?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. The flowers bloom, the songbirds sing, and though it's sun or rain, I walk the mountain tops with spring from Georgia north to Maine. As you can see, this was early in the springtime when I followed the cool weather north, so it arrived in summertime in Maine. This was on the top of the mountain, about 3 miles from Mount Oglethorpe, as I was searching for the mountain. I had asked a man in a little town to the west where the trail began or where Mount Oglethorpe was, and he sort of looked puzzled and he said, well, I don't rightly know, mister, but it's one of those tops out there. So I was out there looking for it, and this was the day before I actually started the hike. The hike started, the southern end of the trail at that time was Mount Oglethorpe, which is named after the first governor and the establisher of the state. And this pavilion, this monument is on the top of the mountain, and it is approximately the same height as the highest mountain in Pennsylvania. This old sign, which is long since gone, tells you that it's the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail, a mountain footpath extending 2,050 miles to Mount Katahdin in Maine. The trail has since been changed and it now starts from Springer Mountain, about 20 miles to the north. It was a beautiful day with a buttermilk sky, which meant that there would probably be rain very soon, and there was that very night. And it really was... It was springtime and there were no leaves on the trees, but down in the valley you can see a little bit of green beginning to show. Still, it was early spring. It was actually like winter in this state. And as you come up the mountain farther north, on the same day I came to Amacolo Falls, which is one of the highest in the eastern United States. This is not the sheer drop of 100 feet, but it's a total of around 500 feet. And you could hear this roaring for half an hour before you got there and a half an hour after you left. The trail now starts north of there, and this is the approach where they come into the state park and then go up to Springer Mountain. At that time the trail was following roads much of the time, and this is in the Chattahoochee National Forest, a typical CC road, I guess you would call it, built during the time of the Depression. The first night it was raining, and this was not the tree, but it was a tree such as this that I slept under the first night. It was blowing and raining, and in the middle of the night it just blew in under there and I got all wet and I had to get out with a flashlight and find some bark to sit up against. This is directly across the trail, and there were many hundreds and even thousands of trees across the trail at that time, which made it very difficult. That was, by the way, was a chestnut tree, and there were many thousands of them that had died in the south, and whole mountains would be full of these trees. One of the high points in Georgia is Blood Mountain, and this is the stone cabin on the top, and it is named that because there was a bloody battle between the Creeks and the Cherokee Indians centuries ago, and it was a great slaughter there. This was one of the few times when the Indians engaged in real warfare, where there were hundreds or even thousands of men killed or wounded. The trail crosses these savannas, they call them, in the south, which is about 4,000 feet or above the level of the highest point in Pennsylvania. And you see the white mark on the tree, which is the distinguishing mark of the whole trail, the white blaze commemorating the axe blazes of the pioneer days. On the floor of the forest there are little flowers there, forget-me-nots, bluets, and they were all over the woods. I had to walk on the flowers because there had been very little traffic at that time and there was no well-worn path. In the south, they graze cattle in the national forest the same as they do out west. This is one of the fences that's up across the mountain. And as I would be going along the mountain, I'd hear bells way off in the distance. And I never knew till I got there whether it would be horses or cows or pigs or sheep or whatever. And sometimes it'd be maybe 100 pigs just running around in the mountain and rooting up the acorns and so forth. We're now back up into North Carolina after emerging from Georgia after about 1 month. And this is the tower on the top of Standing Indian, which is 5,280 feet, I think it is, that are about a mile high. And it is known as the Grandstand of the Southern Appalachians. You can see in all directions the mountains and so forth. And you see the towers were large. Whether this one is even here anymore, I do not know. They've changed the strategy. They use helicopters now instead of towers. And they had a stove and a couple of bunks and all kinds of equipment in there, and they stayed in there for weeks at a time, in the summertime especially. And many people think that the Appalachian Trail was an Indian trail, and to some extent it was, but the Great Warpath was in the valley to the west, in the Shenandoah Valley. But there were many Indians, the Cherokees especially, living in the southern mountains, and I found these arrowheads in one spear point along the way in washes and so forth. The trail was in pretty rough shape at that time, but I posed them there against the background of dirt. This is a view from Wesser Bald, another of the high balds, which are called that because they were literally that. They were clear of trees on the top and grassy. And this is looking down the Wesser Canyon, and at the time I was talking to the tower man, I had stayed there overnight, and this was taken in the morning after the clouds had dropped and it cleared up. It had been rainy when I came in there, and in the distance you can see the silhouette of the Great Smoky Mountains, the dominant ridge of the eastern Appalachians, and the point on the right there is Clingman's Dome, the second highest peak east of the Rocky Mountains. It's about 66, 50, something like that in elevation. The trail goes right along the top of that. And I went on down into the canyon, and in the canyon I came on this old remains of an old grist mill where they ground the cornmeal and so forth for the cornbread. This has long since disappeared. I've been back there and there's nothing left of it. It has rotted up in 40 years' time. And down into the gorge of the Metaga River. The rivers of the south rise in the eastern part of the mountains, and they flow west and break through the Smoky Ridge and the highest mountains and go out into the Tennessee Valley. And this is down in the Metaga Gorge. The peak in the back there is over 6,000 feet high. And I had lost my way and got down into the gorge, which I was not supposed to do, but I ended up climbing up that peak to get out of the gorge. Practically had my clothing torn off by the greenbriers, one of the tough times that I had on the trail, which were many. Now we're coming to Fontana Dam and Fontana Village down to the south, in the back, down below. In the background is the Great Smokies. And I had picked up with two other guys at this time, and we went down into the village to try to find out where the trail was. It had actually been changed at this point and went across the dam, but we didn't know that. The marking had disappeared, and nobody else seemed to know where the trail went, even in the park or down in the village. So we just did the best we could. And they quit that night and went home, I guess, and I headed up into the Smokies the next day. This is Gregory Ball, the first high peak at 5,500 feet elevation on Sheep Pen Gap. You can see that this was once grazing land, and the famous Cage Cove is to the left and down in the valley, and there's a trail running up, and the settlers in the cove used to bring their cattle up there and graze them up on the top of the mountain. This would be timberline up in the New England states, of course. And near the top of that peak is this shelter built of shakes, mainly. It's one of the few built that way on the trail, but it's typical of the Adirondack type lean-tos. And the spring is down below, and this is now gone. They have actually relocated the trail away from this, and that shelter is gone. There were flowers, of course, as I said, there were flowers all along the way, and this was up in the hardwood part of the Great Smokies, and the spring beauty were everywhere. Now there would be at least a 2-foot wide trail beaten right down to the bare earth. But this was way back in '48 when things were a little different. Actually, I met very, very few hikers. Now there are hundreds or even thousands on the trail. And this is in the heart of the conifers, fir and spruce that are up on the top of the Great Smokies. It's virgin timber about 100 feet high. And it reminds me of the old mountain song, in the pines where the sun never shines. Turn it on. Keep going. Top of the Great Smokies is open in many areas, and this was Spence Field, about 1,000 acres of this open pasture land right on the top of the mountain, and it is now overgrown. You don't find this anymore. The state line of Tennessee on the left and North Carolina on the right. The trail goes right on the top, and I walked this by moonlight, and it was so quiet that I could hear my own footsteps crunching in the grass. The only other sound was whippoorwills way down in the valley. I walked most of that night, came in to the shelter. This is Spence Field campsite, actually, the highest one east of the Rocky Mountains, at about 6,000 foot level. Then I came about midnight into the shelter. This was taken the next day, Spence Field shelter. And when I came in, there was a bright moonlight overhead, and it was dark inside, and out front there were picnic tables all full of food. Some was in the frying pan, some was on plates, and it looked as though there was about a dozen people there, but I didn't hear anything, and I looked inside, and the place was empty. And I was so tired after about 15 hours of hiking that I just went to sleep in the shelter. And the next morning I looked around, and there was a couple of empty whiskey bottles under one of the tables, so I guess the people got to fighting and just left and left everything sit. This is looking back over Spence Field the next day. You see why they call it the Great Smokies. Almost always have that smoky line, and in the foreground is the remains of forest fire. They had a very bad fire in there just a few years before. Of course, this is all grown up now, and you'd never know there had been a fire. Here again, you see where the whole side of the mountain burned off, and now it has grown back in 40 years' time. The trail goes down through Newfound Gap, which at that time was the only road across the Great Smokies, and it is about 1 mile above sea level. And this memorial here, this odd-looking thing, is in honor of the Rockefeller family, who donated much of the land that went into the park, and also money to establish the park. The rest of it came from the states of Tennessee and North Carolina. The bottom line says Mount Katahdin, Maine, 1,700 and some miles away. Of course, that's where I was headed. This is looking from the tower on the top of Clingman's Dome, and out yonder is Mount LeConte, which is about 6,300 feet elevation. And on the left you can see the road that comes up out of Newfound Gap. Notice the trees, the highest points in the Smokies have trees over them. This would be timberline up in the north. And balds definitely were not a result of altitude. This was called can't think of it, but anyhow, this is the result of a fire which burned off all the vegetation, and there was a sheer drop of about 1,000 feet to the left, and just this narrow little ledge running around the rocks. They tell you not to ride horseback here because the horse will lose its horse sense and liable to fall or drop right off the side of the mountain. I felt like crawling around there on hands and knees, is how bad it was. In the northern part of the Smokies, I passed one day through this beautiful corridor, like between the bushes. There were tiny bell-shaped blossoms and scented the air with a fragrance. Usually when you get into the Smokies, you hit a lot of rainy weather. It's actually a rainforest. But I had 4 beautiful days. It had rained before that and it rained a lot afterwards, but I had beautiful weather in the Smokies. At the northern end, I took 3 pictures from one point, just to show how many I might have taken on this trip. I could have taken thousands and thousands, but this was taken from one point. To the right is Mount Sterling, the last tall peak, and then straight ahead was Sarvis in full bloom and out into the rest of the mountains where the trail went, and then another quarter turn, I should say, to the left, and the trail going along the side of the cliff. This was actually taken from one point, 3 completely different pictures. From there, the trail slopes down out of the Great Smokies and crosses the Big Pigeon River, where it did at that time on this cable bridge, which has since gone out with a flood, I suppose. I stayed overnight in the little place over yonder. The people insisted I stay overnight, but that's no longer there. There's now a 4-lane highway where that little farm stood. Been a great deal of change. Probably half the trail has changed in 40 years. This is Walnut Mountain lean-to, typical of those built by the CCC during the 30s, during the Depression years. And the last time I was there, it was still there. It's made of chestnut logs, and as long as you keep a roof on it, they'll practically last forever. This old cabin was built by a drafty dodger, you might say, in the time of the Civil War. There were a lot of people from the north, the Scotch-Irish, who were opposed to the southern policy, and they didn't fight with the South. Instead, they went out into the mountains and hid in these little cabins up on the top of the mountain. This is now gone also. There's nothing left there but the chimney at this point. There were many of these all along the mountains, and there were literally hundreds of thousands of them who refused to serve with the rebel army. It's a typical view westward into the famous Tennessee Valley farmlands, and this is out of the park, so they allow grazing here. And you see vast herds of cattle. Sometimes you're faced with a great big bull who will just stand there and bellers at you, and you have to make a detour to get around him. During the Civil War, these 2 cousins tried to come in. They were from the Northern Army. And they tried to get home to visit their folks, and they were ambushed here on the top of the mountain and buried in this lonely grave. And the nearest house is about 10 miles away. And somebody comes there and takes care of the grave. One of the most beautiful streams in the whole Appalachian region is the Noachukki. And here's where it breaks through the mountains into Tennessee. And that night I built my little fire right next to the stream. I could hear gurgling and talking sort of as I went down through. And then a bunch of whippoorwills came in around the fire, and they were all hollering at once. They were so close that their eyes glowed red in the firelight, practically deafened me. I didn't get much sleep that night. It's known locally as the Chucky. That's, well, this is the Metaga River, Mr. Owen.
Not yet.
This is the Metaga River. And the Metaga Valley was one of the early settlements, and at the time of the Revolution, this settlement had the first Declaration of Independence and the first written constitution in this country. And the men from there fought in the famous battle of Kings Mountain, which was one of the little-known battles of the time, but it was one of the turning points of the Revolutionary War. It prevented the British from taking over the southern Appalachians. Incidentally, that's now covered with water. They've built a big dam there and covered it over. It's a big impounding dam now. This is what I call the Briar and Barbed Wire country, and the trail goes right up through all those farms and lots of barbed wire and bristles and bramble and and rails and stuff all mixed up. So I only made about 10 miles in 15 hours of hiking in that area. That was some of the most miserable of all the trail. This is in Virginia, and the state flower of Virginia is the dogwood, and there's just one up above there. These are the flame azalea, for which the state is famous. Azaleas vary from red to white, and those are the flame azalea. This is along the old route of the trail, which is now far to the west. This is along what's now called the Skyline, not the Skyline Drive, but Blue Ridge Parkway, and I slept that night in a cold, rainy night right on top of that stone with a fire in the fireplace. It was down around freezing. This was taken the next day after the storm blew off. North of Roanoke is looked across at the peaks of Otter, and it's named after a stream between the two where the Indians once trapped otter. This is supposed to have been the northernmost range of the Cherokee Nation, which had come from the north originally, and I was on the rocks to the west of Roanoke. And as I went out around Roanoke, past this little shepherd's hut up on the top of the mountain, you can see it was on the trail at that time with a white mark on the side of the hut. This is the top of Peaks of Otter and the fire tower at that time. And the shadow there against the window is the Ranger Jim Luck waving goodbye as I was leaving. He said that a few years before he had been one of the Rangers who was flown to Bar Harbor to fight the terrible fire that they had up there. And the crewman asked him if he'd ever been on a plane before, and he said sure, he figured this was about the same thing. Because when you're up in that tower, you might as well have been in an airplane. They call that Sharp Top. It's a very steep mountain. That's evening. I came to James River, which flows down past the original Jamestown settlement. In the foreground, you see the rhododendron and a very foggy day, as you can see. And at the time, I had been practically without food for a couple of days, so I was in an awful hurry to get down to the shore where there was a little store, and where I got more food. And the next day, I just about killed myself eating to catch up. One of the things I'd been asked as I went along was whether I'd seen any rattlesnakes. Well, I came to an area that was being relocated and there was no trail whatsoever for about 7 miles, so the only thing I could do was bushwhack in the general direction of the next mountain. And as I was in the bushes there, I heard this rattling sound, and only one thing in the world makes that sound. You can see just to the left of the stick there, coiled rattlesnake, had 10 rattles in a button, about 3.5 feet long, which is more or less average size. Oh my, that's upside down. It's a forest where you go through, across the state line into Virginia, and this is a beautiful wood patch of pine trees which are gone now. They've been cut and there's a pasture there now. And just beyond is the town of Damascus, which is very friendly to the trail. They have a big celebration there every year, and try to get as many of the hikers there as they can. It goes right through the town. Here's the point where I camped the night after I stopped at the little store, and that's what I saw in the morning. The morning mist between the long straight ridges which are typical of the central Appalachians. My favorite place always has been to sleep right on the top of the highest mountain. Oh, incidentally, it was in that area that I camped with Bob on that trip. The first night, we had one poncho, and a thunderstorm came along, and we were huddled under that one poncho. West of Roanoke, these are a little out of sequence. Just Roanoke, west of Roanoke, I heard the scrabbling of something up back of the tree, and a little woodchuck came up on this big cherry tree and posed for a picture. They whistle and scare the living daylights out of you sometimes. Some people call them whistle pigs. toughest part of the whole trail at that time was not in the timberline of New England, it was on the pinnacles of the dam. This is the top, well, I was on the one pinnacle, aiming the camera at the topmost pinnacle, and the trail was right up the side of that, and then down the far side, and it's quite a trip. You go down backwards down the far side and into a river, and Dan River, and then up the far side. That's now far off the trail. It's about 50 miles away from the original trail now. It's a shame because it was one of the show places of the whole trail. This was in the Metaga Valley, the big church, Methodist church. As I was going up through the valley, and then also in the valley along the Metaga River, this little undershot water wheel, the only one I've ever seen. I assume that they used it to pump water for irrigation of the bottomlands. Oh boy, we're way up in the Shenandoah National Park now. And these are the Black Rock Cliffs, and the highest point is to the right. This is a national park, and there's no grazing and so forth allowed. These cliffs were apparently caused by a great upheaval at one time, and these sheer cliffs, and the trail was right under one of these, and back to the peaks of Otter. The peaks of Otter, and this is when I was approaching. Before I went down into the first dip, there are actually three of them, and you can see the far rim where the trail resumed up on the plateau. This is a plateau region in the eastern Blue Ridge, and the trail does not go there anymore. This was in that area where I saw the rattlesnake, and this is known as Spy Rock because both sides used this at one time or another as a spy position in the Civil War, and this tiny little miniature lake is right on the top of this dome of rock. And the trail resumed. This was at the point where the trail just sort of disappeared, and there was a sign there just pointed out into nowhere. So I call it a sign pointing nowhere. And the trail resumed on the far mountain there, which is Grandfather Mountain. In the meantime, I just bushwhacked through. Oh my, that's way up in Maryland. That's an outcropping up in the state of Maryland. Yeah, we should have shown this first. This is approaching Shenandoah National Park, Skyline Drive, and the trail was through here originally before the skyline. Then they put the skyline in, and it sort of ruined the trail. It just crosses and recrosses. This is an old farm, and I was told that an old mountain couple lived there, and if I went over, they would feed me the old cornbread and keep me overnight and so forth. But it was noon, and I didn't want to wait that long because I'd promised the family I'd be in a Penmar in a certain time, and I couldn't waste a half a day. But this is now grown up. It's not open like that anymore. In a hurry. One of the shelters or old cabins in the Shenandoah National Park, and you can arrange to stay there, or like a hiking club will stay there overnight for hikes on a weekend. This is the Trails cabin, one of the last of this type to be built by the mountain people. And they said they were never satisfied with, unless they had plenty of fresh air and plenty of pure water. Well, you can see they got the fresh air. They didn't bother to chink the cabin, and they'd have a big fireplace and keep a roaring fire. Here's the rock that fell off one of those cliffs in the Shenandoah and dropped right on the trail. A couple months later, I talked to somebody up in New England, and he said he had just been there, and that rock was still there. But eventually, they didn't move it. I guess they probably dynamited it. Well, up in the top of the park, there was a riding academy, and they posed for this picture. Second from the left is Mr. Lewis, who run the academy, and the horse he's riding is a very valuable trick riding horse that he brought in from Montana. The Appalachian Trail is the master trail for a whole series, a whole network, and this is on one of the side trails down White Oak Canyon. To get down, I had to go down about 1,000 feet and then climb back another 1,000 feet, which is quite a chore when you're carrying a pack. When I'd get tired in the middle of the day, I would stop and sleep maybe 1 hour at noontime, and this is looking up into the pines. I was obviously sleeping on a bed of pine needles. Looking west from the Shenandoah Park into the Shenandoah Valley and the Massanutten Mountains to the west. And the name came from an old guy that said they looked to him like a big old mass of nothing. There was much wildlife along the way, and in this case I just chased this grouse hen up the trail ahead. I mean, her young ones are there among the bushes somewhere. They just freeze and just wait until you go away. And if you don't, the hen will come right back and almost step on your toes and glare at you and fluff up her feathers like an old clip. They're very brave. Otherwise, times they just take off in a hurry. There are now many of these along the trail. At that time, only a few of these stiles to get over a fence. This was in northern Virginia. Later became the general of the rebellion. Oh, this is going back the wrong way. It's really hopeless anyway because it is almost unscalable cliffs. This memorial to the war correspondents, starting with Franklin and others who reported the revolution, was established and built by an ex-war correspondent, of course. It's now in a state park, and this was the high point of the rebel advance when they tried to come through and capture Washington at the Battle of Antietam, which was a preview more or less of Gettysburg. This is the original Washington monument in a state park, rather, and this pavilion has a viewpoint up in the top, and you can spiral your way up to the top. It was built by the people of Boonesboro as a memorial, the first Washington monument. This is, at that time, the signs were very scarce on the trail. It had been about 10 years of very little upkeep because of the war, which explained why the trail was in such terrible shape. And at that time, of course, they thought nobody would ever walk the whole length of it in one trip. This tells you that now down. This is an anthill just after you cross into Pennsylvania over the Mason-Dixon line, and there are more anthills in the area between the Mason-Dixon line and Caledonia Park than there are in all the rest of the trail. Sometimes there are whole villages. There'll be a whole bunch of them. You look like a nice place to sit down and take a rest, but I wouldn't recommend it. Where the trail crosses Route 30 at Caledonia Park, this is the Blacksmith shop, yeah. And it was the only part of that whole setup there to make iron and so forth. It was not destroyed by the rebel army when they came through here on the way to Gettysburg. And they were intending to fight at Cashtown, but eventually the Battle of Gettysburg took place more or less by chance. This is north of Caledonia. The trail crosses the Big Flat, which had been an enormous forest fire at one time, and it was beginning to grow back, and now it is pretty well reforested. That time was a very barren area. When it came to the halfway point, I had a lot of hair then. I had been telling people all along that I was going to walk back to Pennsylvania, and then I'd make up my mind about the rest of it. And when I'd in the south, I would talk with a drawl, and people thought I was from Georgia. But that was so I'd get along better. In the mountains, you're taking a chance at that time, and you were walking alone like that in the mountains because there was a lot of bootlegging, a lot of moonshiners, which I met up with quite often, but always talking my way out of it. And incidentally, this the reason I was able to talk my way out of it was they'd offer me a drink of moonshine, which is their way of making you a conspirator, and then you can't turn them in. But I always told them that I'd taken a vow to Mama I'd never drink, which was very nearly the truth. You know how she was terribly against drinking. But anyhow, this is the center point, and my pack is a lot smaller now, as you can see. I still had the axe. They say you shouldn't carry an axe, but that's a lot of baloney because you really might need it. And it was so cold and rainy and all that I sometimes had to have it to set a fire, make a fire. I decided then I'd try the second half, and this is the White Rocks Trail, and somewhere in there is a little bit of mountain laurel on the right. See it? That's the state flower of Pennsylvania, of course. And this is a white rock, and looking across is a foggy day, and you can't see the north mountain, which normally is visible. This was the high point of the bit of timberline in Pennsylvania. The trail at that time crossed the valley mostly on roads, and this is from the bridge over the Connedyguinet Creek, which would be a river in most parts of the world, and a very placid stream that flows down through the Cumberland Valley. And they say that if you go beeline straight from the source to the mouth of the Susquehanna, it's about 50 miles. If you follow the shore, it's about 250 miles. It's a very winding stream. Here the trail was crossing the Yellow Britches Creek at Brantville. They say it was called the Yellow Britches because the British troops waded through it at flood stage during the French and Indian Wars, and it stained their white breeches to yellow. So everybody called it the Yellow Britches, and it still is to this day. This was on the old trail. Of course, it has since been moved quite a bit west along the Ironstone Ridge, which is much more appropriate. I had been seeing a lot of snakes, especially black snakes, which do travel in cold weather, and one of them down south which I don't show here, was stretched out like a big black stick, and it wouldn't coil up no matter what I did. This one was coiled up in a ball and wouldn't straighten out. It probably was about 8 feet long, if I could have ever got it straightened out. The trail, of course, was originated by Benton Mackay way back in 1921 when he wrote an article in the Journal of the American Institute of Architects, and he said it would be a volunteer trail and commemorating the Western pioneer trails, and these are some of the volunteers. This is the York Hiking Club, and Anna is the second from the right. And they were out on a work trip just east of the Susquehanna River. But that's no longer a part of the trail. It has been moved far to the north. This was right above Harrisburg, near the river. Let's see this. Farther east, the section, well, in fact, all of this section was under the control, I guess you would call it, the Blue Mountain Eagle Climbing Club of Reading. And this is one of their memorials at Pilgrim's Spring, Pilgrim's Rest, and named for Count Zinzendorf and Conrad Weiser, who had stopped there on their way up to visit the Indians in the Wyoming Valley. Don't really know because I haven't been there. This is the Schuylkill River, which flows down to Philadelphia, and the Fort Clinton. Daniel Boone was born a few miles south of here, and his old home is now what do you call it, a national site or something.
National shrine.
And he is supposed to, at the age of 16, he is supposed to have gone up through this valley into the Cumberland, or the Lehigh Valley to the north, and was there for a week. And his family got so worried that they organized a search party, and they finally found him by sighting the smoke coming out of a thicket from his campfire. But right after that, the family moved south into Tennessee. During World War II, there were several planes that crashed on the mountain, and this is the wreckage of one of those planes. The trail was used many times, has been to this day, as a rescue trail to fight forest fires because it's on the top of the mountain and gives the easiest access to an area. this was the next day when it was beautiful, but when I came into here, it was pouring down raining. It was just about dark. And I found 3 Boy Scouts celebrating the end of school. This was in June. And they were so miserable looking at it. It was unbelievable. They had not gotten any firewood. They were burning a fire inside the shelter and the last couple sticks. So I went out into the woods and brought in some firewood and did a good deed for Boy Scouts. All these pictures are diversified. They show the unusual, but this is what you see most of the time on the trail. Just the path through the woods and the white mark on the tree and the sunshine coming down through the canopy. My favorite picture of all of them. Now this was a piece of trail, believe it or not. It was so overgrown sometimes that it was pitiful. And in this instance, I almost walked right into this snake, this grass snake, which is right in the middle of the picture there. And his tail goes down off the left side. They're so well camouflaged that you seldom spot them. But the trail was terribly overgrown, and I would get soaking wet even on a nice day because of the dew, the heavy dew. My feet were wet almost all the time. Just looking out into the famous Lehigh Valley toward Allentown, which is hidden in the fog. And this was straight out, and I took another picture directly straight down to show I was on the edge of the precipice. And sometimes at a point like that, I get the weird feeling that I could step down and walk right on the top of those trees. But don't ever try it, mister. My shadow's down there someplace, very small. The eastern part of Pennsylvania has some of the roughest rock terrain on the whole Appalachian Trail. This is the actual trail. One guy had signed one of the registries and said, "What are these? The Appalachians of the Rockies. My feet feel like hamburgers." Trail comes out to Delaware River at what they call it?
Delaware Water Gap.
Yeah, Delaware Water Gap. And this is looking across from the ledge across at Tammany Mountain over New Jersey. And the trail no longer goes up over this ridge that we bypass this now. And I had to go 10 miles south to get across the river. Now there's a bridge across, and you can go right over on the bridge. But this was down in the park, and near here I met an old gentleman who had come up from the resort down in the valley, and he said he'd been coming there for about 50 years. And said it was his favorite spot. It's being rejuvenated now and reopened, I think, as a major resort. This is one of the pavilions. And he had been over much of the world, Central South America and Europe. And when we parted, we came to a turn in the trail where he went one way and I went the other, and he looked back and he said, "Vaya con Dios." Of course, that's the last I ever saw of him. He must have been 80-some years old. This is looking down into the valley, into the gorge, and there's now a major highway comes right across that point. This is the bridge that I had to cross about 10 miles to the south to get over onto the other side. At that time, it was the only covered bridge, so now there's none, I guess, on the trail. Oh yeah, that's just exactly what I need. Up till now, I haven't passed a single lake. All the southern mountains except for the only lakes are the impounding dams. And now as I come up on the New Jersey, I come to the first natural lake, which is called Sunfish Pond. And it's in a big scout reservation, and you wonder where all the water came from to fill that lake way up on the top of the mountain. And from now on, I saw lakes every single day of the trip, and sometimes several of them. There was a move a few years ago. They were going to use this water to power an electric system or something for a big industry, but the people rose up in wrath and stopped it. It's still place for the Boy Scouts. See the AT sign, Appalachian Trail, another rocky stretch, and this is in the western part of New Jersey, where it's surprisingly mountainous. They have the Kittatinny Mountain. Looking down on one of those lakes along the way, and there are many, many of them. One of the highest, this is not the highest point, but from here I could see the highest point, and this was a Sunday morning, and his family was out having a picnic out on the mountain, at Sunrise Mountain, and they could drive right up close to this, of course. He's taken a picture there. He took a short sequence with me and with a movie camera, and I've never been able to find him to try to get a copy of it. This is the highest point in New Jersey, called High Point. And the trail there turns east down into New Jersey. And then it comes up along Greenwood Mountain, and this is the lake. We're looking down from the ridge. There's a lot of mountains and a lot of forests in New Jersey, really more than I expected. This is Inspiration Point. I had to take a picture of that. Beautiful lookout there. As you come up toward the Hudson River, you have a swampy area, and it's an interstate park, Palisades Interstate Park, and the trail crossed a boggy area on this little homemade bridge. Now this is a special interest because it is a stone shelter built on top of a big boulder with a fireplace in each end. You can see the chimneys. And in the middle of the moonlight night, I heard my kettle rattling. I had a kettle full of water setting in on the ledge, and it woke me up, and I looked, and there was a big old raccoon drinking water out of my kettle. Well, he scuttled out of there, and then he came back. And somebody had left a box of spaghetti in the shelter in the back, and he brought that out front and tore it open and was chewing on this dry spaghetti. I didn't get thirsty and go drink some of my water, and this kept up for a while until I fell asleep again. The next time I woke, there was dirt falling on my face, and he was trying to crawl out with my pack, which was hanging above me from the roof of the shelter. You do this because of the pack rats and so forth. And that time I yelled, and he took off again, and the next time I had a big stick there, and I whacked him a few times, and he took off and didn't come back. And the morning came, I was wondering, was that a dream, or did it actually happen? Here's just to the right there, you can see just a little bit of the Hudson River, and the top pier, there's a little white spot there, the top of the Bear Mountain Bridge. And this is the lowest point on the Appalachian Trail, practically at sea level. And there I had to pay 5 cents toll to walk across the bridge. The only toll I paid anywhere on the whole trail, and that was it. Now I don't know what it is, how much, probably $1, I guess, for now. As I crossed over into Connecticut, I came to a shelter in a state forest, and there was my little campfire that night. And it was a light rain, and it was hitting the fire, and the fire was kept burning real good, and the water was making it hiss and so forth. It was almost like it was talking to me. And I just sit there and you think about most everything under creation, as the guy down in the south said in the tower. And you're all by yourself out there in the wilderness. You just think of everything. Took several, just to give a sort of an illustration. Now this drops deep into a deep pool, and the next picture, I hope, yeah, this is probably the most remarkable picture I took on the whole trail. This is the base of the falls to the left. The camera was practically touching the water, and I'm taking a picture of the bottom of the pool and the sunlight hitting the pool about 3 feet below the water level. This was a part, unfortunately I didn't get any of them up in the world. During a rainy night, I crossed into Massachusetts, and the cloud, as often happened, dropped into the valley, and I was on an island above the clouds. Now that, back in that other picture, showed the high point. That in the background is the highest point in the state of Massachusetts, Bromley Mountain, and this is the memorial on the top of Bromley Mountain. This is a famous skiing area, and the ski... now we get into the state of Vermont, the Green Mountain State. And this is the first part of the Appalachian Trail to be built, because it was built as a part of the long trail which extended the length of Vermont from Canada down to the Massachusetts line. And it was originated, the idea for it, from Benton MacKaye, the same man who came up with the plan for the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, he got the idea for that when he was on this trail. He worked for the Forest Service for many years. He was a regional planner and very smart man. He's the one that originated the idea for these interstate highways. He was the one that originated the idea for the Tennessee Valley Authority and various other things. He was a regional planner and really a smart. Built a 7-foot high dam. This is looking down into the valley from the next high point into the Hudson River Valley. One of the famous battles of the Revolution took place here just before, my memory is gone. This is the area where Daniel Webster made an oration before 15,000 people at a Whig Party convention, and it was far, far from any houses or any other civilization. And he drew 15,000 people way out on the mountain. This is Stratton Pond and Stratton View Shelter and Stratton Mountain in the background. And Benton MacKaye was in the top of the tree on the highest point of that mountain when he thought up the idea for the Appalachian Trail. See the shelter on the far side. Now we get the Twister and the Shin Cracker. This is Bromley Mountain, yeah. And there are many ski runs there, and they're very atypical and very appropriate because there's always a first aid station at the top and a first aid station at the bottom of a ski area for obvious reasons. That'll be the most... Oh, no. This is one of my favorite spots, a little rocky pond, and it's so deep they've never found the bottom. It probably was a volcanic crater at one time. And the shelter is out on that little island. And I took this picture from the shore, and then went out. There was an old leaky old boat there, and I paddled out into the lake and took this picture of the shelter on the island. Incidentally, up there, anything less than 10 miles long is a pond. Anything longer than that's a lake. This is a pond. I was coming up along the Green Mountains, along the long trail, and this is Pico Peak there. They've made an effort to turn this into a ski area, and they may succeed yet. I don't know. It's a shame, but they're doing that to almost all the mountains. In that area in the gap where the road goes across, the trail turns east. There's no man or missing link, they called it then, because nobody had worked on this about 30 miles for over 10 years, and the trail just turned. There's a sign pointing, and I went through there by compass mostly, and came out eventually to the Connecticut River, and this is that college, Dartmouth College. It goes right through there, right through the campus to cross the river on the bridge. They have encountered on the trail, and this is one of their cabins, which are used by hikers and also by skiers in the wintertime. Their highest shelter is up on the top of Moosilauke, which gives a terrific view of the rest of the White Mountains. And the rocks to the left are typical of the cairns. You can have a snowstorm or heavy fog in the middle of the summer, and if so, you follow these piles of rock, known as cairns. There have been dozens of people died in the New England states in the White Mountains just because they were foolish and went up there without proper clothing or food. You can have in fact, one snowstorm came in the middle of summer and there was 10 feet of snow on Mount Washington, which we'll see later. This is the Beaver Brook tumbling down the other side of Moosalaki, and you can see a homemade ladder there to the left where you crawl down. So I took one picture close-up just to show how the water swirls and curls and turns as it goes down into the Lost River Canyon, goes over on the other side. On the end of that mountain is the Great Stone Face. I was right above it when I took that other picture. This was immortalized by Hawthorne. It's like a great profile of a face up against the mountain. That evening I came into Greenleaf Hut, and as you can see, it looked a little bit threatening as though it was going to rain, and it did rain that night. And there's a hut crew, college boys that maintain that, and you can stay overnight and get meals. And they said, "You're going to stay tonight, aren't you?" And I said, "No, I guess not. It's not quite dark yet. I'll usually keep on when it's dark." They said, "Well, it's going to rain tonight. You better stay." I said, "Oh, I guess not." And I said, "Well, there must be some reason why you're not staying." So I said, "Okay, you want it? I'll tell you. I have only $1 in my pocket." And it cost about $5 or $6 at that time, probably a lot more now. And he just sort of smiled and he said, "Come on, guys," and they went over to the table and they sat down and they had a conference. And they came up with a little document, I guess you'd call it, which I should photograph and would go into this show eventually. It said, "This man has come all the way from Georgia on a trail, and we feel that he should be deadheaded to the entire system," which meant no pay, for free. And they insisted on giving this to me and fed me that night and kept me overnight and wouldn't take anything for the next day's breakfast. Normally, everybody else left before I did. And of course I had met the Biddles there for the first time, two young brothers from down near Philadelphia. And they offered to pay for it, and another guy from Ohio offered to pay for it, and the crew said, "Nope, we're going to deadhead him." So they all left in the morning. By that time it was really miserable looking. And I started off up the mountain, and those three hut crewmen came out of the shelter. Usually they didn't even bother to come out to see anybody leave. But they came out there and they just stood in a row, all staring after me. As last thing when I looked back, I could see them still staring after me as I went up that mountain. I guess they wondered, where in the world is that guy going to stay tonight? And along that trail, I saw a spruce hen. You see it right in the center of the picture. You see its head and breast. They're so tame that you could almost catch them by hand. They look like a pheasant, but they're totally different in their temperament. This is the Biddle boys this is the second time I met them. They were goofing, as they call it. They drive to a gap and hike back in, and then go back down and go to another gap, do the same thing. And they came in one way and I came in the other to this old shelter, and in fact within 1 minute of each other. And they said, "Let's celebrate. Let's have a big feed. What do you have?" I said, "Well, I can make some of my cornbread that I make in a frying pan, and I've got a few other things." And they said, "Well, we have a can of peaches we've been hoarding for the last week or two, and some dried soup." So we got together and we made a feast. And Bill there on the right, he watched me making this cornbread. It was made by using either cornmeal or oatmeal or flour or any mixture of the three. Just throw some together and a little bit of brown sugar and some baking powder, and mix it all up and then fry it in the frying pan. And if it had mostly flour, it was biscuits. If it had mostly cornmeal, it was cornbread. And Bill, he looked at it, and I was making it, and he said, you know, I ought to call that Wonder Bread. He says, I watch you make it, I wonder what it's going to taste like, and I wonder if it's going to hit the pan when it comes down. It was a great big cake. It fit the frying pan, and I'd flip them. So that's what it was from then on. It was Wonder Bread. And I often thought that that's probably the origin of the term Wonder Bread that they use on bread today, because I mentioned that many times at some of my talks. This is Mount Washington again in the distance. It's 6,283 feet, I think, in elevation. Highest point north of the Carolinas and east of the Rockies. Here's much closer, and this was July, and yet there was snow in some of the crannies, and I couldn't quite believe it, so I went over there and took a closer look, and sure enough, it was snow all right. This is the shelter, or hut, I guess you'd call it. It's kind of big for a hut, but there you can stay overnight. They were enlarging it at the time. In the background, there's a spur, and you can see a trail of smoke from the pepper sass, they call it, the cog railway that runs to the top of Mount Washington. When they asked for a franchise to build this railroad, one of the legislators said, why don't you ask for a franchise to the moon while you're at it? There's 3 ways you can get to the top of Mount Washington. Now there's 4. You could go by helicopter, but then you could walk up, you could drive up, or you could go up the cog railway. Now here's the road that you could, the toll road that you could drive up. Of course, the trail goes over those 2 peaks out yonder, Madison and Monroe. They're named after the presidentials, that's what they call them. And here's one of the little brooks as it was going down off the end of Mount Madison. I had spent the night right close to there. We came into the Beaver, the Lost Pond they call this, and it's a series of 3 ponds built by Beaver, and it seems as though they had 2 reasons actually for building it. One was to slow the water, and the other was to lessen the impact in case of flood, so that the dam wouldn't be broken. That was down in back the wrong way. Let's see, that's over in New Hampshire, and in the background are the Mahoosucs, which is not very high mountains, but they're very rugged. And the trail at that time went right through the town. It's not now. We go in just soon after crossing the Main, went up through this area. You can see there hadn't been much walking through there. There'd be a 2-foot wide bare path now. This you'd sink about up to your ankles in moss and so forth, and through the spruce, which is the most common tree in Maine, and it's used a lot for paper pulp. And a lot of Maine is owned by the paper companies. This is just after I got into the state of Maine. And then to my left is the 3rd highest peak in Maine. That's called Old Speck. You see how flat it is? Well, there's a cone, a lake, a high lake right in the middle of that flat top. And way out yonder is another of the peaks. As you go over it, these are still the White Mountains. Here I was looking down from the top of Old Speck into the notch, Mahoosuc Notch, where the trail goes down through the notch.